Uh, Welcome to this workshop on in relation to the discussions we have had on the democracy chapter, trade unions and democracy. We're really happy to have with us today Dr. Tim Pringle, who is lecturing at the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, at the University of London in UK, and who found time amidst his very busy schedule to actually prepare really a very interesting video lecture on the Chinese labor movement. So Tim, our participants are from all continents. We invite them to write the country where they're from after their name, so you can also have a sense where they're from. And please write your comments, or afterwards you can make your comments or questions directly. But Tim, can we perhaps start with a question that is in relation to a general point that you make in your video lecture? And I'm quoting here: the labor movement in China has experienced dramatic periods of resistance, rupture and re-emergence through waves of struggle, all in very different political contexts, end of quote. I'm sure there will be many questions about the actuality of the labor movement from the activists in this workshop, but I would like you to highlight some of these critical moments of labor movement's response to ruptures, and perhaps the key characteristics of the emerging responses from the labor movement, which perhaps helps us to understand the state of the labor movement today.
Okay, thanks, Adlira, and thanks to GLU for organising this, and most of all, thank you to you guys for coming to take part and in the discussion. So I'd answer the question really, I think, in two parts, really, Adlira. So the first thing I'd say is that rupture is not always negative, and I think that resistance by labour movements in China over the years has generated various levels of response from the state, and these responses can be violent, repressive ruptures, or they might be positive, major concessions in some ways. So I'll try and build on that in my answer there. So research by colleagues and comrades of mine, Elaine Hui and Chris Chan, I think that taught us, and this is one example of a rupture, that's, for example, if we look at the labour contract law of 2008, we saw the reactions there from the employing classes, both the businesses, what do they call them, chambers of commerce from America, arranged from America and across Europe, and again to Chinese employer and bosses and business associations in China itself. Their reaction to the labour contract law was what, to use David Harvey's term, might be called a class struggle from above. Their aim was to get rid of the worker-friendly sections of that law, or at least have them watered down. And I've argued in the video and elsewhere that I think that the labour contract law itself was an outcome of that great driver of history, the other side of class struggle, the class struggle from below. So in other words, I see that labour contract law and some of the other laws that accompanied that year in 2008 really as a positive rupture that was driven by workers' organisation, and certainly in attempts to both improve working conditions and we could maybe discuss this later, the devil's always in the detail, and to increase workplace, at least influence in the workplace. My other example, I'm going to look beyond the paper that I provided, and sort of some readers may, or some of you may have noticed that I skipped over the Cultural Revolution in the paper simply because it's such a complex period of time, really. But I'm going to draw on a brief example from the Cultural Revolution itself. This was in the mid-60s. I would frame this in many ways terrifying event as an outward manifestation of inner party struggle, or at least the role of workers in it. And Mao focused very much in launching the Cultural Revolution. It was an attempt to defend his position in the party hierarchy and policies that drew from it, really. But he focused very much on student activism to defend his position. And he was emphatic that production should be maintained and workers, if I may use the expression, kept at the bench throughout this whole period. But workers did enter the fray, and they did pursue large economic demands. And Mao's response, or the Chinese Communist Party's response to this widespread worker unrest, was to call in the army to restore order, in inverted commas. In other words, this is a negative a negative rupture, also driven by forms of class struggle. And I've chosen these two very different examples, really, from very different periods in Chinese history. One a market-orientated period, the other a really chaotic period in the command economy. And why I picked these two very different examples is to demonstrate that since 1949, contrary to what is to how workers in China are often portrayed, workers have not been passive. They've been active subjects in pursuit of their own collective aims and interests, really. I think there are other ways to think about this as well. Another key moment in the relationship between Chinese workers and democracy, which is after all the title of this discussion, is an episode defining moment during 1989. So and the emergence of workers' autonomous federations. Now, some folks here, I'm sure most people know what happened in 1989. There were widespread protests that paralyzed Beijing and other parts of the country, involving millions of ordinary citizens and students in demands primarily for an end to corruption, but also for democratic reforms. And the workers' autonomous federations, although they weren't the first autonomous federations to emerge since 49, they were by far the most important. And they produced dozens of pamphlets of commentaries on that focus on workers' subjectivity, on rising inequalities, on poor and non-existent workplace representation, and like the students themselves, they focus on the issue of corruption as well. They also became almost de facto safety officers or pickets on huge marches, at least two huge marches through Beijing calling for democratic reform. On the other hand, these organizations as well really kind of are, these workers' autonomous federations are kind of make us think, or they make me think of some of the other side of how we might characterize labor movements in China since 1949 and possibly before, although that's open to debate. In that the federations weren't able to make any kind of transformative leap from the streets into being an organized presence in the workplace. And I would hazard a guess, and maybe I'm foolish in doing this, but I would hazard a guess that if they had made that transformative leap to being organized presences in the workplace, heaven forbid, even organized trade unions in the workplace or representative workers' organizations, we'd be having a very different conversation than the one we are having now, as they may have harnessed a collective power that tanks and guns can't always suppress. So, excuse me for kind of engaging in that kind of, or indulging in that historical what ifs, but I do think, or I hope I've touched on one characteristic of the labor movement that I think was embedded in your question there, Ed Lira, which is, or labor movement and class struggles in China, which is so far there hasn't really been a move beyond episodic and intense periods of struggle or class struggles into what Kevin Lin, my friend and comrade Kevin Lin, has referred to, drawing on the labor literature on deep organizing. And by that, I interpret this as being that as yet we haven't seen the establishment of sustainable labor organizations and networks that are enmeshed in working class communities with their own autonomous narrative and inclusive organizing methods around democratic accountability. That isn't to say that workers haven't demanded that. That isn't to say that we haven't come very close to moving in that direction. But of course, we haven't got there yet now, or Chinese workers haven't got that yet. Now, the reasons why this hasn't happened to date are, I mean, we could have a whole workshop on that, and maybe people have got views and questions on that, why that hasn't happened. But on the other hand, I would argue that the reason can't just be put down to authoritarian repression. Important as that is, I think the reasons may be a little bit more complex than that, if not linked to that. So that's my response, Edna, to your initial question in trying to think about relationships between Chinese workers' struggles and democracy and some of the characteristics of the movement that we've seen emerge so far, or movements that we've seen emerge so far.
Thanks very much for that, team. Very, very important to actually set the context for our conversation. So the floor is open. Who would like to make a question or a comment? I can also read the questions that came with the registration, but I think it would be great if people who are sitting here would make those questions. Yes, Benji, please.
Thanks, Adlira. Hi, team.
Hello, Benji.
Beverly Silver wrote this book, right, about the labor movements and labor struggles all across the world. And she makes this distinction between Marx type and Polanyi type struggles, right? So I guess in the Marx type struggles would apply to China, right? So I don't know. Would you agree with that? Would your what you know about the labor struggles in China fit into that classification?
The short answer is no. I wouldn't necessarily apply that directly to China. I think Silver's work is really important, and I think I know the book you're referring to, or one of the papers of what you're referring to, her 2003 book on sources of labor power. I think if we're going to use that kind of Marx-Polanyi pendulum, if you like, or criteria for thinking about labor struggles in China, I think the work of Qin-Kuan Li is very interesting, in which she published a book called Against the Law in 2008, and it's on the extended reading list that I provided in the paper. I think that's a really interesting deep dive into different forms of labor struggles in China, which kind of I tried to touch on in my paper as well. On the one hand, she did describe as Marxist struggles the resistance of formerly state-owned enterprise workers to the restructuring that really took up at a pace following the 15th Party Congress in 1997, when the Chinese Communist Party gave the green light to restructuring, which in some cases was just restructuring, but in many other cases was full-scale privatization, and depending on what figures you can rely on or draw on, led to redundancies of between 30 and 50 million people. Now, Qin-Kuan Li, or CK, referred to the struggles that push back against this restructuring processes in Marxist terms. She used Marxist terms to describe those struggles. And I think, if I may add to that description, I think what was very interesting about that period, which I think kind of probably peaked in 2002, and I could go into some detail in some of the struggles that swept across, particularly Northeast China in that year. But I think what really interestingly characterized those struggles, and indeed the policy of the party itself, this was high-risk stuff. State-owned enterprise workers in China had been at the heart of the China Communist Party narrative for best part of half a decade, 40 years at least. Whether they really were at the heart or whether that was part of the propaganda is another debate. Nevertheless, that's where they placed themselves, and the Chinese Communist Party laid 50 million of them off, or took that risk through these restructuring processes. So that was high risk for the party. How they pulled that off, how workers responded to that, I think is great. But CK Lee does use them looked at them through a Marxist lens. On the other hand, she looks at what she called the sunrise struggles of the new, what I called in the paper, and what people like Pun Nai called in the paper, the new working class, mainly made up of very young off-farm migrants that came in 3 or 4 waves from the countryside into the special economic zones, into the new, again, to use David Harvey's zones of accumulation. That she describes these really as citizenship struggles, i.e. in Polanyian terms, if you will. And what is key about these, I think, is key about her analysis there, is they're grounded in this, or they're rooted in this kind of second-class citizenship status that these migrants had, and the fact that their struggles and their collective demands were often about changing that status into getting access to kind of better treatment generally. There were administrative institutions in Chinese known as hukou, or restrictions on where you live and what you do where you live, that drove these protests. But nevertheless, we're going to stick to your characterization there, or Silva's characterizations. I think that they do fit. So I would disagree with a kind of blanket application of Marxian struggles to describe Chinese labor protests. I think it's more complex than that. I think we have two strands of it, probably even three or four strands now as things get more and more complicated. But it's very interesting stuff. And so, for example, the emergence of that new working class as well, is given empirical meat, if you will, to notions of arguments and really interesting discussions around issues of semi-proletarianization, a la Peng Nai, or a very well-known Chinese researcher, Peng Nai, or indeed class formation in China in the period of the People's Republic. Does that answer the question, Benji?
Oh yes, definitely.
Great question. Thank you. Yeah.
Something to think about.
Thanks very much. Gifford.
Yes, hi. Yeah, wonderful video lecture. My question, you kind of answered some of the things I was going to ask about the hukou system and the household registration, but kind of to pivot from that, I really wonder if the whole shop floor of the world that had existed in the Pearl River Delta is disappearing with deindustrialization and the relocation of production further into the hinterlands. And was that just a natural evolution of kind of capitalist development? Or was it pushed by things like the 2010 Honda strike, which from my understanding was a gear and axle works that shut down production of cars because the supply chain was so lean that once they shut down one plant, other plants had to shut down. And did the Chinese authorities realize that they should disperse production even more? I was just really wondering, kind of maybe is the production in the Pearl River Delta going up the value chain and pushing more of the heavy industry out of there? Or could you kind of bring us up to date to the current developments? Because the Pearl River Delta seemed to be the hub of so much of that development, from the Shenzhen Special Economic Zone being the first one and all that. That's my question.
Thank you, Gifford. Wow, there's a lot in that one as well. Let me try and be as brief, and I'm not going to cover it all. But I mean, thank you for raising that famous 2010 Honda strike. And some of you may remember that picture that went around the world of those young. They were actually student workers, student interns doing their kind of internship in inverted commas as part of a year's factory work in a Honda strike. And they for people who don't know, they went on strike. They forged very strong alliances with core workers, or kind of more formal workers at the plant there in Foshan, just outside Guangzhou. And they launched this extraordinary 19-day strike, during which they demanded a 30% pay rise. They demanded the right to elect their own trade union representatives, and they demanded something else, which I can't remember. They kind of won the strike. It generated a significant amount of noise and support among the global media, among the local media, interestingly, and also among labor NGOs that were becoming very active in China around that time, in China and Hong Kong. There was that classic picture where I don't mean to laugh, but it is quite funny, where there's a picture of these young student workers in a bit of argy-bargy, a bit of push and shove, with a bunch of older guys in yellow hats. Unbelievably, or perhaps believably, these guys in the yellow hats had come down to the workers' picket line to break the picket line and force them back to work. So this gave us a really graphic illustration of the kind of very conservative nature and perhaps democratic deficits of the party-run trade union. One of the reasons, to go back to Benji's question on Silva as well, I think one of Silva's great contributions in that 2003 book was she developed, may he rest in peace, Eric Olin Wright's work on structures and sources of workers' power. And I think one of the reasons that Honda strike was so successful is because they did win substantial concessions, was because the factory was making transmissions. Now, I'm no mechanic, but I know you can't make a piston car, you can make an electric car, but you can't make a piston car without a transmission. So when those transmissions stopped coming out of the factory, it had a spillover effect that went right back to Japan across other factories in China and back to Japan. So as Silver and Olin Wright and others would call it, that it drew on extraordinary structural power, workplace structural power in the workplace. Now, whether that encouraged the Guangdong authorities to continue their already started policy of industrial upgrading, I would say probably my hunch is, but I also think there were wider processes going on that was driving capital either out of certainly like capital invested in unskilled and semi-skilled sectors in Guangdong province in South China, that was driving capital either abroad, out of China altogether, or to West China. I should say that I had a labor activist and scholar who I was lucky enough to supervise his PhD, who did a whole PhD on this capital movement to Chengdu in West China, and to other parts of China as well. So, and I think what was driving that capital, definitely labor unrest was one of it, but also the outcome of that labor unrest. Wages were going up in Guangdong. Workers were becoming more and more confident. Labor NGOs supporting them were beginning to play a bigger role as well. So I think there were lots of factors driving capital into the hinterland, if you will. Not least as well, overall state policy, which definitely wanted to move away from the structural imbalances that all that investment going into the East and South China had generated. That was very important for regime or states or political stability. And the second factor there on chasing that strand of it down was the policy of industrial structuring being upgrading, should I say, being pursued by the Guangdong government, Guangdong and Guangzhou governments, and they were very keen on this. They didn't want to. They wanted to move on from the workshop of the world, if you like, to be the high-tech workshop of the world, if I may use those terms. I should say on this I think it came out, I'm not sure, 2013 maybe. A friend of mine, Florian Bortolo, wrote a wonderful book on the Guangdong government's policy of industrial upgrading, where he did recognize this process. This process was definitely happening. So that's, the kind of short answer to your question there, Gifford. But also he looked at, the factors driving that, which I hope I've tried to explain. But also the fact that with this industrial upgrading, it didn't necessarily come with social upgrading. It didn't necessarily mean that the sweatshops disappeared and low pay and wage arrears or poor safety conditions disappeared either. A more complex process. Does that address it, Gifford? Thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Tim. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. One of them, we're trying to get the Spanish version just to make sure we have it right. But there is one from Comrade Joshua from Manila, who is asking, I believe that the working class in China will eventually find a way to rise collectively. In the meantime, what can we do from outside China to help build solidarity?
Wow, now there's a question. Thank you, Joshua. Yeah, I hope that the working class everywhere will eventually rise and impose a more democratic and accountable system of production on our employers and the rest of them. In the meantime, what do we do, particularly in China? I think that at the moment, very good question this, at the moment, we are seeing a post-COVID re-emergence, and this is tracked by labor NGO organizations such as China Labour Bulletin Strike Map. We're seeing a re-emergence of collective protests, particularly in the manufacturing industry, but also going on that in new platforms of platform capitalisms, if you like, as well. We are seeing an uptick in the levels of struggle, going back very loosely, I think, to the levels around about 2013, not the high point of 2014 or 2015, or indeed going back to 2010, but we are seeing this definite uptick. I got the figures somewhere, but yeah, to around 2013, and this uptick is being driven by wage arrears, by another wave of factory relocations and shutdown, and by wage demands as well. I think we can support support the Chinese working class in this in a number of ways. I think first thing is by making people aware that struggle is going on, that workers' labor struggles does go on in China, that it is widespread. There is this kind of bit of a myth that has been strengthened by President Xi Jinping's kind of tightened form of authoritarianism. I mean, China's always been a one-party state since 49, but with the type of authoritarianism we've seen since about 2014, 15 is much tighter. There's much less space really for organizing, and particularly for people to support organizing. But it's not stopped. You know, in this post-COVID era, we are seeing a reemergence of class struggles, of significant levels of class struggles, and they are having an impact. So I think we need to spread that impact. Where we have contacts in supply chains that end in China, or which China is part of that supply chain, or indeed China might these days, the way that Chinese capital has been going out and being invested in other parts of the world, China is sometimes at the investment end of the supply chains now as well, in south need to look for weak points, for choke points in those supply chains, and when we can safely intervene, then we should do so, either through our own trade union organizations, by passing motions, by putting pressure on brands, by offering solidarity in any way we can along that. It might be through a union motion, it might be through a solidarity collection. There are safe ways sometimes to get money in, but we need to be very careful about that. And obviously China is an authoritarian state, so how to offer solidarity is quite a skilled thing, actually, when to and when not to. And there are organizations and individuals that can help with that. But I think the main thing right now is to keep an eye on those waves of struggle as they emerge, to kind of to publicize them, and where there are choke points, it might be in a supply chain, it might be in a corporate social responsibility initiative that is not coming out with the goods, it might be in some of the opportunities that have emerged in due diligence laws in countries like Germany recently, that put responsibility on the brands for what's happening down their supply chains. I think that we can do that. We can offer support. I mean, it's not like, we're not going to pull people out across the supply chain in sympathy strikes. We're not at that stage, but sometimes it's this kind of, I would argue, it's this kind of bread and butter work of doing what we can when we can, with due diligence ourselves, with a view to the future, that can really pay off dividends. Maybe that's because I'm a hopeless optimist. I don't know.
Thanks very much, Tim, for that. Any other question? Meanwhile, perhaps I can take the question from our comrade from Peru, Isis, whose question is in relation to the suicides in the Foxconn company in China.
Oh, okay, I've just got out. This is from Isis. Yeah, okay, thanks, Isis. So I read suicide threats of suicide as a measure of single what labor and coming. Oh, so yeah, those suicides, there were 17 suicides about 10 years ago. They were really tragic events. I would say they were the outcome of 2 or 3 factors. And this is through talking to people who were involved in solidarity campaigns and stuff. I haven't talked to any relatives of the workers. So it is based on what I've read and talked to with people who were involved, not directly from the workers, but or the families of the workers rather. So there were 2 or 3 factors going on there. One was Foxconn's managerial policies, which were absolutely brutal. You weren't allowed to talk at work. They would tend to, and remember, the people working in Foxconn, these were really young people. 18, 19, 17, sometimes younger. They had come thousands of miles across China to work in these, struggling to get jobs in these really brutally kind of managerial hegemonic run factories where people couldn't talk. They were split up, so people were not with people in their hometowns. Often people together came together from the same hometown. They were all split up to stop any solidarity. It was a very a very kind of militaristic form of management, and people suffered profound homesickness, isolation, and tragically 17 young people took the path of suicide. At the same time, some have argued, and I think there is worth on this, as sad as it is, that this was also a form of protest as well, when desperation that reaches that much. And there is that, there are, sadly, there are traditions of suicide in Chinese labor organizing traditions. So whether they were part of that, I don't know enough. What do we do about it? That is the question, Isis. And I think that's a question you asked, and that's the key question. Well, what we don't do is do what Terry Goh, the managing director of Foxconn, said incredibly cruelly. His response at a press conference says, well, we don't really have anything to worry about because the suicide rate among Foxconn employees is lower than the suicide rate in China as a whole. So we'll just put a few suicide nets up. And that is pretty much what they did. That rightly caused huge outcry, not least among other Foxconn workers themselves. And Foxconn, as a result, has been moved to mitigate those hegemonic managerial practices. Not entirely. During lockdown in COVID, Foxconn were again at the forefront of a very brutal lockdown, and indeed the white paper movement that ended the lockdown policies in China, or the very harsh lockdown policies in China, should I say. Foxconn workers were at the forefront of that because they rioted. They were so fed up, not just at lockdown, but crucially how lockdown was implemented. So what to do? So that's one thing to do. Like, we pressure Foxconn in any way we can. Again, one of their main clients is Apple Computers. So there's a choke point if ever there was one. Also, Foxconn have something like 11 million workers, I think, employed in value chains around the world. So we can find choke points in that. Ultimately, though, Isis, I think that the policy that is really going to change this is it's not on the horizon at the moment, but is ultimately what underpins all this is the absence of freedom of association. Now, we have seen what we might call post-socialist states move towards forms of qualified freedom of association. Reforms to or adjustments to the labor code in Vietnam are beginning to allow what they call workers' representative organizations at enterprise level. Now, again, I'm not so stupid and optimist to think that's going to happen in China, but maybe that's what we should be thinking about. Maybe that is our aim. So be that as it may, whether it's the right tactic right now in terms of providing support, probably not. Or whether it will become one day, I hope so. But ultimately, that is how to reduce to kind of push back on these bullying hegemonic managerial systems is through establishing the right to organize, really, I would say.
Thanks very much for the question and the answer. Of course, we have Ronald from the Migrant Workers Network in Botswana asking about the question on the Marxist ideology, which is
Hi, Ronald. Okay, let me have a quick look through it, Lyra. So my question is on Marxist ideology, which used to be assimilated in China, Russia, and other communist states. Is it still applicable? Oh, that is a great question. I think probably I haven't been doing kind of activism work in China for some time now. By that I mean working with labor NGOs or interviewing migrant workers and that, or indeed city work as well. Among the kind of new emergent working class, it's very rare that you would get any genuine kind of knowledge of Marxist ideology or Marxist thinking or Marxist analysis of capitalist social relations. I think that is probably one of the reasons I mentioned early on of why we're not seeing the emergence, or we haven't seen to date, should we see, of a sustainable autonomous labor organization in China, is because the state or the party, it hogs the language, it neutralizes and anesthetizes the language in Marx that is about working class struggle. It takes that, it appropriates that, and I would say it kills it dead. So if you ever want to, in terms of if you ever want to kill a young worker's enthusiasm for for organizing and stuff, then it would be to start quoting the Communist Manifesto at them. Sadly, that is the case. I'm a great fan of the Communist Manifesto, but that is sadly where we are. In state-owned enterprise workers, it's a little bit different because of the traditions coming through. Marxist ideology, or Marxist thinking, should I say, is still alive in some areas there. And I think also, if I can bring the two together, it's a rather extended answer here, apologies, but there was a struggle in JASIC, in a company, Japanese-owned company in JASIC, I think about 2017, 2018, where essentially Maoist student organizers got involved in this struggle. Now, the relationship between Maoism and Marxism is perhaps for another time. I don't think they have a lot in common. But what was clear is that the student activists involved in supporting the JASIC struggle knew their marks. They knew that they were very clear that China, that there's the kind of capitalist social relations that the workers that were struggling against and that they were supporting were capitalist socialist relations. They had nothing to do with socialism, and they needed to be confronted. Sadly, they were repressed. Many were chucked out of their universities. Some are still under some form of detention. Actually, I think the detention has ended now. But so there's no doubt that Marxism is still alive. It's just is it to the extent in China, the extent to which it is alive inside the working class, I think is debatable. And I think one of the reasons for that is because the ruling class in China, or the manifestation of it, the Chinese Communist Party, kills everything innovative, imaginative, and hopeful that we can find in Marxism. That's my thinking of it anyway.
It'd be interesting, Tim, to find time to come back to the question you said earlier, that authoritarianism plays an important role, but it's not fully explaining actually why we don't see the emergence. Because here you're making a very important point that the system assimilates any sort of language of resistance to actually neutralize. So perhaps we can pick up that point, but meanwhile, I would want to take up the question from the Narcisse in the chat box. Perhaps you want to read it yourself.
Okay, yeah, I'll just go through it. It's very important for today, especially in most of the Africans where government are taking as a model of development. Okay, in this context, we can see, do we have to take, which key lessons do we have to take as African workers? Chinese are building a loss factory in China. What loss of abuse? What do you think that we can do? Oh wow, another good question. So I mean, I referred to this. Thank you, Narcisse, for this great question as well. I kind of referred to this idea of Chinese capital going out of China and being invested in other parts of the global south and actually the global north as well. Widespread investment in the global north, and I think Africa has been one of the key. The continent in Africa has been the key thing here. I would defer to you, Narcisse, on the details. It's something I'm very interested in. I've been on the edges of a report that looked at Chinese capital investment in Ethiopia and Angola, in Ethiopia, in the garment sector, in Angola, in the kind of more infrastructure state-run sector. Those results of that research, and it was very carefully conducted research really there, and it kind of, the findings went against some of the kind of mainstream stories really. Now obviously our reports, I would defer to you on this, Narcisse, on this anyway, but let me summarize the findings. The findings of that was that no matter which way we look at it, the impact of Chinese investment was no better or no worse than investment coming from multinationals in the global north as well. And this kind of finding was also backed up by other research by people like Deborah Brautigam and Qin-Quan Li, essentially, as well. At the same time, what they did notice that the Chinese enterprise did tend to be there in the long term. So Qin-Quan Li points to the example is when back in the day, I've forgotten the exact dates, but when in Zambia the market dropped out of copper prices, most Western investors left very, very quickly, The Chinese didn't, they stayed. Now that actually generated lots of really interesting, both economic and political struggles between Zambian workers, their Chinese employers, on investors, and the new Zambian president as well. It was a very interesting period. But nevertheless, the outcome of the research tends to suggest that the abuses of labor conditions, the outcomes for workers in Chinese-owned factories is no better or no worse than Western global TNCs as well. On the second part of the question is, is this kind of the importation of the authoritarian system of the Chinese People's Republic? My research and my thinking on this is, yes, undoubtedly, when investment goes into, be it from the north or the east or the south or wherever it comes, there is a temptation of the investors to take with them the kind of labor systems that they're used to. However, at the same time, I would say it is very difficult for any brand or any bank or any investor to completely reproduce the labor relations system, in this case from China, a very authoritarian one, in the country of destination of investment. They may try, but usually existing workers' organizations, be they in unions or other forms of organization, tend to put the stoppers on this. Not always, but they do tend to kind of push back very effectively on that, either by drawing on various narratives as well. The question, Chinese are building a factory, we see a lot, there is a lot of abuse. What do you think? What can we learn to organize a more fair agreement in this? Again, I would say on 2 or 3 things. On one hand, I think for African states generally, and I don't mean to mix up ruling classes with working classes, any kind of false what's the word I'm looking for? False patriotism. But at the same time, I would say, since the Western imperialists were booted out, at least physically, Chinese governments in Africa have been caught between structural adjustment policies, the neoliberal good governance agenda, and now suddenly China comes along with its apparent lack of conditionalities to loans. I think there is a role there that unions, and again, I may be hopelessly optimistic, can pressure their own governments into using this opportunity to play off one set of investors against another. A, to get as much as possible out of the investors. B, to limit the extraction or to constrain the extraction of surplus value. C, through improved working conditions and employment possibilities, and indeed general life chances as well. So I think, again, Narcisse, maybe you think I'm being optimistic, but I think there are opportunities there, and there are examples of those opportunities bearing at least a little bit of fruit as well. I think that is a really important question that you're asking, and key to kind of, in many ways, how to build a labor movement moving forward in China and beyond China as well.
Thanks very much, both for question and response. Any other question or comment, short comment from anyone? If not, Tim, can we perhaps go to what you say you could talk about, your own explanation of why a genuine labor movement is not emerging in China?
Well, I should caveat all my responses on this. I hope that maybe other people in the room will have their ideas on this as well, which are every bit as valid as anything I got to say. I mean, but I would caveat any response about that. I'm not Chinese. I haven't lived in China for 10 years, and the liberation of the Chinese working class is going to be the act of the Chinese working class. So my observations are very much through my own study and my own past, trying to contribute to the movement there, and my own thinking on the subject over 20 years, really. I think, of course, repression plays a key part. But there are other labor relations regimes across the planet which are sadly even more repressive than what's happening in China. Maybe in different ways, maybe Chinese labor activists are rarely rounded up and murdered. They're sometimes imprisoned, they're often sacked, they're subject to all sorts of surveillance and monitoring, but they're rarely taken off and shot. And that is what we see in other parts of the world as well. They are sometimes, those labor activists in China have in the past been subject to violent assaults by thugs, rounded up by employers. We saw that with the labor contract law in 2008. We've seen it many times since. This kind of extra, almost kind of paramilitary thinking and drawing on organized crime to intimidate worker activists. Of course, we've seen it in America, we've seen it all the way around the world. We do see it in China now. So we've got state repression, we've got the ability of the state to forge allegiances, or maybe not so much the state, more kind of local employers with the local state playing a blind eye to that kind of violence. So violence plays a great part. Authoritarianism plays a great part. We talked about language and the expropriation of the language of struggle, the language of Marx, the language of class, the language of kind of the bread and butter of many organizers around the world, really, and including and in China. You do get genuine Marxist organizers in China, of course you do. I would add to that as well, is China is, and this is often kind of ignored in the bourgeois media or the Western press very much. China is a country of huge diversity. And I don't just mean the official figures of, however many it is, I think it's 57, 56 ethnic minorities and all the languages and cultures that they bring with them. But it is also, it is where kind of, different, that diversity can bring language issues. It tends to get people to kind of silo in just talking to their own groups from their own hometowns or their own counties or provinces, rather than a genuine mix across. And I think that kind of that intermixing can take time. I have seen it in my own research and talking to folks say, because of hukou and because of the residential restrictions and the power that can give employers can give, say, I can remember talking to a factory boss who made yoga mats. I think she's still there, actually. I think she's still running that factory. I did keep vaguely in touch with her. And she had a factory of about 200 or 300 people. And she had folks from Hunan province, she had folks from Sichuan province, and she had folks from Henan province, I think. So these are 3 separate provinces in China, all at least 1,000 miles away from, or 800 miles away from her factory, sometimes up to 1,500 miles. And she deliberately worked on those divisions that created. She encouraged people not to mix. She kept people from Hunan in the Hunan dormitory. She kept people in the Sichuan from the Sichuan dormitory, etc. So I think employers are very good at, as they are around the world, they're very good at manipulating the way they meet labor. When capital meets labor, it doesn't meet labor as a blank slate. Labor brings all sorts of stuff with it, social, cultural, culinary, linguistic stuff with them, all different ideas, and employers can use that to divide. I think that's another factor of why we haven't seen a labor movement in China as well. A fourth factor, I think, also builds on the sheer size and diversity of China, which is, that diversity can mitigate against being able to find material stuff in common across such a huge country. Northeast China, up in Heilongjiang, is so different from Yunnan down in the southwest, both weather, climate, and all that. So I think those factors can mitigate as well against a kind of coherent national autonomous labor movement emerging. We've seen glimpses of it. We've seen Volkswagen workers about 5 years ago, organized just before the pandemic, organizing across space, really across thousands of miles to try and what's the word I'm looking for? Try and coordinate their responses to management anti-labor measures. We saw in Walmart. I did a report of this for China Labor Bulletin. We saw in Walmart just that sort of in the Walmart worker struggles, just tiny emergence of people being able to coordinate across distance through social media and other things. But there again, the state has become so good at surveillance and monitoring of social media that can also be very difficult as well. Not impossible, there's still platforms like Douyin, which is a kind of Chinese, well, TikTok is Chinese, but a TikTok platform, a short video platform available in China where many workers post glimpses of their struggles. So I could go on this. I feel I'm talking too much, but there are lots of factors that all of which, of course, are linked to the current regime that mitigate against a national coherent or even transnational coherent labor movement emerging. It doesn't mean that it won't, but I think if we just put it down to repression, and if we just put it down to the fact that then we kind of there's a trap then of falling into the trap. Well, freedom of association is kind of reified into being the only solution. Now, of course, it is a very, very important part of the solution, but there's other stuff that everyone here on this call and all the people we know and all the trade unionists we know can do stuff in between as well. I'm going to stop there in case other people have got other views, and please, I'm sure people will disagree with me. They should, because I certainly don't have the answers. I can see 8 messages, probably all
exactly. I think
good.
we can have this conversation for a really long time. It's extremely fascinating. Yes, there are a few questions. I don't know if you want to read them, but while you read them, of course, I think you make a very, very fair point in comparing it with more repressive labor regimes, and the fact that in those you would still have autonomous labor movements. And I would put my own country there, where we have freedom of association, but the shock of a totalitarian system has been so powerful and automizing the society that the only thing that drives people is really accumulation, and then really how do you collect as many goods as possible. And that's what we see, the mass consumerism in China. So I think that could also be perhaps another area of exploration. But we have questions in the chat box.
Okay.
I leave it to you to decide which of these questions you would want to engage with.
Let me. I think we got. What time are we going on to, Adlira? Is it?
We have about 10 more minutes, but
okay.
we can just take the questions. If you
okay.
find it fantastic.
Let me quickly work down through them. So I'm going to start with Benjamin. Benji, are there links, or were there in the past, between workers in Hong Kong and mainland China? Wow, I could literally talk all day about that. The short answer, Benji, is yes. The longer or more caveated response to that is that those links tend to be around Guangdong province in South China, but not only there, mainly because there are kind of linguistic and cultural links between the two. But I mean, this is a fascinating area, particularly since the national security law in Hong Kong has sadly meant that many of the labour NGOs, but particularly the Hong Kong Confederation of Trade Unions, have been more or less forced to dissolve in the face of that draconian national security law there. But Benji, if you want to contact me about that and talk some more about that, I mean, there's so much to think about there, and there is a lot that can be done there, I think, as well. Thank you, Ronald, for your very kind words there. I think Chinese worker Essie, you're saying I think China's worker policy should be a bit more flexible. I agree entirely. I think they should also be a lot more worker friendly as well. They're not the worst labor laws in the world, and interestingly, Chinese labor laws on paper, notwithstanding the absence of freedom of association, do give workers the scope to use the law, as famously the Shanghai Daily put it back in 2006. 2 workers use the law as a weapon. Workers do that in China. They're pretty good at that. In other post-socialist countries like China, like Vietnam, to lesser extent in Russia, they don't use the law. In Vietnam, workers have no truck with the law. They don't think it's any good at all. But in China, it is interesting that Chinese workers do use the law and are pretty good at using it as well. Joker, you're building on the earlier question from Narcisse. Yes, I think that the Chinese employers who are operating in Zimbabwe have a military response to workers' issues. Could this be attributed to that background? Quite possibly. I would say we need to look at each response. We need to look at the details of this as well. Are they drawing on local paramilitaries? Are they drawing on their own paramilitaries? Are they drawing on the Zimbabwean army there? Are there deals between local governments and Chinese investors? I mean, I would love to talk about this some more, Joko, because I'm very interested in this. And I think it's really important as well to, to try and use this as a moment, really. So, but for our side rather than their side. So, a great question. I kind of, without more details, I would say yes. The short answer is yes, but it's much more complex than the simple importation of one labor relation system from one country to another, because generally that's quite difficult to do. Hian Dong, regarding the de-China policies that lots of states are trying to pursue to be out of there, okay, which will lead to lots of change in the labor market solidarity. What do you think will be way out for workers and okay, so Hian Dong, what I'm saying from that is that because some countries are trying to move away from their reliance or on China or on Chinese markets, really, is that going to have an impact on workers and democracy in China? Oof. These are great questions, by the way, really, really challenging stuff. Thank you, everyone. I think that I can remember during the struggle against apartheid and in my own union back then, and there was the idea was to boycott because the ANC in general and COSATU in particular, that was the trade union federation there. They called on workers elsewhere and unions elsewhere to boycott goods in South Africa, to not buy them because of this evil apartheid and racist apartheid regime. Chinese workers rarely do that. And I think, I mean, interestingly, I don't know. I think the answer is very nuanced, is very, needs to take on a case by case basis, and with as much input from Chinese workers as we possibly can. There's a very interesting debate going on in Canadian trade union circles now over the tariffs on electric vehicles that are subsidized by the state in China and are flooding or not flooding, that are being imported into Canada, and Canadian automobile workers feel that is threatening their jobs, which it may well be. That then, then there's a balance with, we're in a climate emergency right now. How do the unions respond to that? And I think the fact that, the Chinese state is so strong, is so able to pick winners, to develop industries in the way it did. And I don't actually have a problem with states supporting industries. I think it can be a very positive thing. I think the problem is capitalist competition, not state support for their own industry. I think that the issue is there. So I think there are some really interesting ideas about how we react to this kind of de-China or de-linking from China. My position is not with the China bashers or the China haters, which is that we just need to de-link and have nothing to do with China. We're in a very different and more complex world than that, I would argue anyway. But yeah, I'm sure other people have other positions on that. Hian Dong, you mean directions of the labor movement in China? Okay, so the direction of the labor movement in China, I think, will, again, I've never heard of Chinese workers saying that foreign trade unions need to boycott or need to de-link from China. I haven't heard that call. That's why I made that comparison with apartheid South Africa and COSATU's calls to boycott South African-made goods. But Hian Dong, if I'm not answering the question, please do get in touch with me. Hopefully you've all got my email. Radmas, is there any similarities between labor movements in Africa and other parts of the globe? How best can Africa tap the knowledge? I think, Radmas, I think that there are similarities and differences, but similarities in labor movements all over the world, not just from Africa. I think that labor movements have a lot to learn from workers in struggle on the continent and in the continent of Africa. I think this knowledge is two-way. For too long, and I might be out on a limb here, but for too long, I think that knowledge of labor organizing, of labor, of defending workers' rights has traveled from the global north to the global south. It's time we change that. The most interesting examples of struggle are coming out now, and I do a lot of work on this at the university, are coming from the global south. And I think, we need to respect that. And, the knowledge goes two ways, very much so. Apalua. Is the labor movement in China gagged as it is in other parts of Africa? I am Comrade Elogen. Good to meet you, Comrade. Hello, Joe. Yes, it is gagged. It is definitely gagged. It is anaesthetic. You know, the state tries very hard to gag it. Workers cannot say what they want to say. So the methods they use to organize have to be done, you know, very subtly, very nuanced, until that moment of intense class struggle when it tends to come out in the open. So for example, you wouldn't in China stand up and say, we demand the right to organize autonomous trade unions. You wouldn't say that because you'd be looking at 3 or 4 years in prison in some form of detention. So you have to find other ways to do it. So what we discussed here is, how do workers do it? How have they done it? And how will they continue to do it? And as many of you asked, how do we support them in they do that? Bill, hello, Bill. Nice to see you. Lovely tea you gave me, by the way, tea. That Kenyan tea, Bill, was great. Can the fact that China's rapid economic development be also a factor against the working class movement in China? So many people have heard. Yeah, good. Another great question there. So what China has done is, in terms of its own internal development policies, is in through one lens is quite dramatic, really, quite miraculous in many ways, if I can use that biblical term, in that it has lifted in a very short period of time over 600 million people out of absolute poverty. And I think the fact that they have managed to achieve this, albeit starting from a very low baseline, has attracted attention of many governments in the global south and the global north, who may be willing to turn a blind eye to the more repressive nature of the Chinese state regime. At the same time, and there's a lesson for us here, and Bill, we discussed this in class, I know, I remember it very well, is that you can grow an economy, you can lift people out of absolute poverty, and at the same time, you can bake in hard structural inequalities, in sometimes quite extreme inequalities, that continue this cycle of capitalist development that really, in the long term, doesn't really offer very much to workers in the long run. Anyway, that is not to underestimate the perils and hardships of absolute poverty. Of course, I'm not doing that. But you can grow poverty. You can grow a state. You can develop a state, and at the same time develop really tough structural inequalities, and I think, you know, some people have called this Chinese neoliberalism with Chinese characteristics, or market socialism, or whatever you want to. I don't think it really matters what we call it. I think those inequalities will hopefully be mitigated by the only movement on earth that is going to, in my view, that's going to mitigate and reduce those structural inequalities is the labor movement itself, really. Joshua, same in the Philippines, freedom of association in our constitution, but yep, okay, severely hindered. I would say same in my apologies to American comrades here, but you know, you have the right to organize in America, you have the right to organize here in the UK. It's become a little bit easier in the UK, not least because of the election of a Labour government, or a government that calls itself Labour anyway. In the US, you have the right to organize, but my God, try doing it. It's really hard. There are so many bylaws and other factors that mitigate against that, you know, not least contractualization. Okay, for your response. Hinden, thanks for that. I understand that it's still a big question regarding your mention of it. Yeah, I would love to, Hian Dong. Yeah, I'd love to talk to anyone from Vietnam who's interested in labor right now. You may know a friend of mine, Joe Buckley, who lives in Vietnam there, speaks, he tells me brilliant Vietnamese. Maybe it's not that good, but yeah, I would love to talk about it. Hian Dong, please do contact me. Joshua, thank you for your questions and your own insights as well. And I really appreciate those comments. Whew.
Oh God, thank you so much. This was really such a valuable and inspiring and stimulating discussion. Thanks so much, Tim. I hear people want to have a continuation of this discussion, and we can definitely do that. But right now, in a sort of a sprint, it's not a marathon with all the different chapters and workshops, but we could definitely organize a conversation to continue actually this discussion. Very important, because it's not just China, as you say in your video lecture, what happens in China doesn't stay in China. So thanks everyone. Thanks Tim for a really fantastic conversation. And
thanks, Tim.
We will see you tomorrow for the last workshop on the democracy chapter.